Spain, from the Silver Empire to the Sun Never Sets Afterglow. Part 2. From Philip II to the Spanish-American War, the truth behind the decline of the Spanish Empire. Welcome back to Deep Sight. I am your time navigator, Lawrence Stardust. In the previous episode, we traced Spain's history from its unification in 1492 to the abdication of Charles V. Charles V divided his vast empire in two, and the Spanish Habsburg dynasty was inherited by his son, Philip II. Today, we will continue this journey from the age of Philip II through the destruction of the Invincible Armada, the decline of the Habsburg dynasty, the arrival of the Bourbons, Napoleon's invasion, the turmoil of the 19th century, and finally the collapse of the Silver Empire in 1898. Station 4. Philip II and the destruction of the Invincible Armada. Philip II, son of Charles V, was the most powerful monarch of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty. He ruled for 42 years and was the helmsman of the Spanish Empire at its zenith. Philip II was a Spaniard through and through. He rarely left the Iberian Peninsula, confining himself to the offices of the Escorial, a vast complex that served as palace, monastery, and mausoleum, perfectly reflecting his character: stern, austere, and religiously fanatical. He had two obsessions: Catholic unification and Habsburg global hegemony. He once declared, "I would rather not be king than rule a kingdom with heretics." Philip's lifestyle was rigidly methodical. He processed vast amounts of paperwork daily, handling everything himself, trusting almost none of his ministers. His desk was piled with reports from the Americas, Italy, the Netherlands, and Asia. He was known as the King of Paper. His court, unlike his father's humanist circle, resembled a cold religious fortress. A Venetian ambassador once remarked, "He is neither warm nor cold, neither generous nor stingy. Everything about him exists in a precise middle state." In 1571, the Christian League fleet, commanded by Philip's half-brother Don John of Austria, defeated the Ottoman navy at the Battle of Lepanto. It was a decisive Western victory over the Ottoman Empire, establishing Spanish dominance in the Mediterranean and earning Philip the reputation of defender of the faith throughout Christendom. But religious zeal came at a cost. To sustain the empire's enormous military expenditures, Philip imposed heavy taxes, leading to three national bankruptcies in 1557, 1575, and 1598. Each bankruptcy devastated Spain's bankers, yet Philip never slowed his expansion. He was like a relentless machine, constantly pouring American silver into the gaping holes of European warfare. Why was maritime supremacy so important? Before answering, we must understand, why was control of the seas so critical to Spain? In the 16th century, Spain's lifeline was American silver. Each year, treasure fleets laden with silver crossed the Atlantic from Mexico and Peru to Spain. This silver financed Spain's wars and diplomacy in Europe. Without it, the imperial dream could not survive a single day. Whoever controlled the seas controlled the silver routes. Maritime supremacy also meant trade monopoly. Spain sought to block direct trade between other European nations and the Americas, maintaining its monopoly. To challenge Spain's naval power was to strike at its very heart. Furthermore, maritime supremacy meant global power projection. A strong navy could threaten enemy coasts, cut supply lines, and protect colonies. With an empire spanning 4 continents, Spain could not survive a single day without a powerful navy. Why did Philip II execute Mary, Queen of Scots? Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, was a Catholic and a rival to England's Protestant Queen Elizabeth I. Many Catholic powers considered Mary the legitimate heir to the English throne. Mary had been imprisoned by Elizabeth for 19 years, but her very existence was a political threat. As long as she lived, Catholic factions could use her name to foment rebellion. In 1586, Anthony Babington plotted to assassinate Elizabeth, free Mary, and place her on the throne. Philip promised military support. Elizabeth's intelligence service intercepted the correspondence, and Mary was tried and executed. Philip, who viewed Elizabeth as a heretical obstacle to Spanish supremacy, was further determined to conquer England. For Philip, England was not only a haven for Protestants, but also a backer of the Dutch revolt. Only by conquering England could he truly pacify the Netherlands and uphold Catholic orthodoxy. The Spanish and English fleets compared. In 1588, Philip II assembled a vast fleet of 134 ships, 8,766 crewmen, and 2,431 cannons. The Spanish called it the most fortunate fleet. The English called it the Invincible Armada. The Spanish and English fleets had fundamentally different designs. The Spanish followed traditional boarding tactics, closing in to grapple and fight hand-to-hand. Their cannons were short-barreled heavy guns, effective only at close range. The English, by contrast, used long-barreled light cannons with longer range and faster firing rates, allowing sustained fire from a distance. English ships were smaller, faster, and more maneuverable, able to turn easily in rough seas. Spanish galleons, though large and sturdy, were sluggish and difficult to handle in the Channel's treacherous waters. The Spanish commander, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, was an army officer with no naval experience. He had written to Philip, stating he was unfit to command this fleet. But Philip had no better option and appointed him anyway. The English fleet was commanded by experienced seafarers like Francis Drake, who had honed their skills in privateering. The Armada's destruction. In May 1588, the Armada set sail from Lisbon. Almost immediately, it encountered a storm, damaging several ships and forcing it to put in at La Coruña for repairs. It was not until July that the fleet set sail again. On July 29th, the Armada entered the English Channel. The Spanish learned that the main English fleet was anchored at Plymouth. Admiral Recalde and other officers urged an immediate night attack to destroy the enemy in port. But Medina Sidonia hesitated, and a fierce debate broke out in the War Council. That hesitation cost Spain its only chance. In the ensuing Channel skirmishes, the English used their superior maneuverability to harass the Spanish, avoiding close engagement. The decisive blow came late on August 7th, when the English launched 8 fire ships into the Spanish anchorage. The Spanish cut their cables in panic and scattered, their formation shattered. The next day, at the Battle of Gravelines, the Spanish lost 5 ships. Though the material losses were not huge, the fleet's discipline and morale collapsed. Worse was yet to come. On the return voyage, a violent storm wrecked many ships on the coasts of Ireland and Scotland. Only about half the fleet made it back to Spain. The Armada's defeat did not end Spanish naval supremacy. Spain still possessed a powerful navy and vast colonies. But it sent a signal to the world. Spain was not invincible. That message was keenly noted by rising powers like England, the Netherlands, and France. Philip II died on September 13, 1598, still reviewing documents on his deathbed. He had ruled for 42 years, bringing Spain to its territorial zenith while planting the seeds of its decline. He left behind a debt-ridden empire, a religiously divided Europe, and a Spain poised to fall into a full-blown crisis in the next century. Station 5. The Habsburg Jaw. How inbreeding destroyed a dynasty. The Spanish Habsburg dynasty ruled from 1516 to 1700. For nearly 2 centuries, this dynasty conquered half of Europe through marriage. The Habsburgs had a famous motto: "Let others wage war. You, fortunate Austria, marry." But there was a second half to that motto that the Habsburgs never spoke aloud. And once married, marry your own relatives. How did the Habsburgs practice inbreeding? To preserve the purity of their bloodline, the Habsburgs intermarried for generations. This unwritten policy, lasting 150 years, ultimately destroyed the dynasty. The inbreeding chain stretched back to Charles V's time. The Spanish and Austrian Habsburg branches frequently intermarried. Philip II married 4 times. 3 of his wives were close relatives. The last king, Charles II, was the son of Philip IV and Queen Mariana, both Habsburgs, and Mariana was Philip IV's own niece. Philip IV fathered 13 legitimate children, but only 2 sons and 2 daughters survived to adulthood. The consequences were catastrophic. The gene pool shrank, and hereditary diseases intensified. The most visible sign was the Habsburg jaw, mandibular prognathism. From Charles V onward, each generation of Habsburg monarchs had an increasingly pronounced jaw and distorted facial features. By the time of Charles II, the situation was horrifying. Did people know the dangers of inbreeding? In fact, people had long suspected the risks. The Church had long prohibited close-kin marriage, based on religious and moral grounds, but also reflecting an intuitive biological understanding. However, the Habsburgs, for political gain, repeatedly obtained papal dispensations to bypass these prohibitions. For them, purity of blood was more important than the health of their offspring. Charles II, the product of generations of Habsburg inbreeding, suffered from severe physical and mental disabilities, multiple genetic disorders, intellectual disability, and epilepsy. One historian wrote, "From the day he was born, people were waiting for his death." According to contemporary accounts, Charles II was short, frail, suffered from bowel problems and impotence. He did not speak until age 4, did not walk until age 8, and his jaw was so misshapen that he could barely chew or swallow. Charles II died on November 1, 1700, leaving no heir. The autopsy report described him as not a drop of blood in his body. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs corroded, his intestines rotten and gangrenous. He had only one testicle, black as coal. His head was full of water. This gruesome report is the most horrifying evidence of a dynasty driven to biological extinction by inbreeding. The Spanish Habsburgs, who had once ruled half the world, were ultimately destroyed by the very strategy that seemed so clever: intermarriage. A dynasty built on marriage was undone by marriage, one of history's cruelest ironies. Station 6. The War of the Spanish Succession and the Bourbon Dynasty. After Charles II's death, the European powers fought over the Spanish throne in the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714. Why did Charles II choose the Bourbon heir? Charles II named Philip, Duke of Anjou, later Philip V, of the French Bourbon dynasty as his successor for 3 reasons. First, Charles II's sister, Maria Theresa, was the wife of King Louis XIV of France. Philip was Louis XIV's grandson and Maria Theresa's grandson. By blood, Philip was Charles II's great-nephew and the closest male heir. Second, Charles II's mother, Mariana of Austria, though herself a Habsburg, favored the Bourbon succession because it would prevent Spain from being absorbed by the Austrian Habsburgs. Third, French diplomacy actively promoted the succession. Louis XIV worked tirelessly to secure the Spanish throne for his grandson, ensuring Bourbon dominance in Europe. This arrangement, however, provoked widespread opposition. Britain, the Netherlands, and Austria feared that a Bourbon union of France and Spain would shatter the European balance of power. The war lasted 13 years and ended with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. Under the treaty, Philip V was confirmed as King of Spain, but he and his heirs had to renounce any claim to the French throne. Spain also lost its European territories in the Netherlands and Italy. Britain acquired Gibraltar and Minorca and gained the right to sell African slaves in Spanish colonies for 30 years. Philip V, the first Bourbon king of Spain, opened a new chapter in Spanish history. Spain was no longer part of the Habsburg global empire. It became a normal European kingdom, still possessing vast overseas colonies, but no longer the dominant global power it once was. The greatest Bourbon monarch of the 18th century was Charles III, 1759 to 1788. He was Spain's most enlightened ruler, implementing a series of political and economic reforms, expelling the Jesuits from Spain and the Americas, curtailing the Inquisition, establishing intendants to improve local administration, and opening free trade between American colonies and Spanish ports. Charles III's reforms somewhat revived Spain's fortunes. In 1761, he signed a Bourbon family pact with Louis XV of France, agreeing to jointly contain Britain, but this drew Spain into a disastrous war with Britain. In 1788, Charles III was succeeded by his son, Charles IV, a weak ruler who entrusted state affairs to the favorite Manuel de Godoy. Spain began to decline once more. Time was running out. Station 7. Napoleon's Iron Heel, the Peninsular War. In 1808, Napoleon Bonaparte's armies invaded Spain. The Spanish called this war the War of Independence. Wasn't Napoleon overthrowing an old regime? Why did the Spanish resist? On paper, Napoleon was overthrowing a corrupt Bourbon monarchy. But the Spanish quickly realized that Napoleon's liberation was merely another form of conquest. In 1807, Napoleon allied with Spain against Portugal. But on the way, French troops occupied Madrid, infuriating the Spanish. Napoleon deposed the Spanish royal family and placed his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the throne. The Spanish fought back. On May 2, 1808, Madrid rose in revolt. Napoleon treated his allies harshly. He trampled them, so they rose against him. The Spanish resisted not because they loved their old king, but because they refused to be ruled by the French. To them, the French were no different from any previous invader. More deeply, Spain was a deeply Catholic, conservative society. Napoleon's Enlightenment reforms threatened the old aristocracy and the church. The war lasted 6 years, 1808 to 1814. Spanish guerrillas paid a terrible price. Though the French held the cities, they could not control the countryside. One French officer wrote, "We control the road from Madrid to Paris, but we cannot control the road from Madrid to any single village." The Spanish insurgency became Napoleon's Spanish ulcer. In 1812, Britain's Duke of Wellington defeated the French at Salamanca. In 1813, the Allied forces crushed the French at Vittoria. In 1814, the French withdrew, and Ferdinand VII was restored. Spain had won the war, but lost its power. The country was exhausted. More fatally, the war had shaken Spain's control over its American colonies, and seeds of Latin American independence were sown. Station 8. 19th century turmoil and the collapse of the empire. After Napoleon, Spain descended into a century of internal strife. Ferdinand VII's background was the son of Charles IV, whose disastrous policies had allowed the French invasion. Ferdinand had been imprisoned in France by Napoleon. When he returned in 1814, he abolished the liberal constitution of 1812 and restored absolute monarchy, provoking fierce opposition from liberals. Spain's regional fault lines. Spain was never a homogeneous nation. Catalonia, the Basque Country, and Galicia each had their own languages and traditions. Basque conservatives rallied to the Carlist cause. Catalonia, Spain's most industrialist region, embraced liberalism. Andalusia, the poorest region, was a powder keg of social tension. Madrid, the center of centralization, tried to control the periphery, but regional resistance persisted. When Ferdinand VII died in 1833, his 3-year-old daughter Isabella II inherited the throne. His brother Carlos refused to accept a female sovereign, igniting the First Carlist War, 1833 to 1840. The Carlists were supported by conservative Catholics, the Basque Country, and parts of Aragon, the liberals by the urban bourgeoisie, liberal nobles, and foreign volunteers. The war lasted 7 years, killing tens of thousands. The Carlists were defeated, but Spanish society was torn apart. 2 more Carlist wars followed, 1846 to 1849 and 1872 to 1876. These 3 wars left Spain exhausted and unable to modernize. Meanwhile, Spain's American colonies won their independence one by one. By the end of the 19th century, Spain held only Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. In 1868, Isabella II was overthrown, plunging Spain into a chaotic 6 democratic years. In 1874, the Bourbons were restored under Alfonso XII. Stability briefly returned, but the empire's decline was irreversible. In 1895, Cuban and Filipino nationalists revolted. Spanish repression was brutal, and American interests were affected. In January 1898, the U.S. sent the battleship Maine to Havana. On February 15th, the Maine exploded and sank, killing 266 American sailors. The U.S. declared war on Spain. The Spanish-American War lasted less than 4 months. In the summer of 1898, the Spanish fleets in Cuba and the Philippines were utterly destroyed, the most thorough, catastrophic, and humiliating naval defeat in modern history. On December 10, 1898, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Spain relinquished sovereignty over Cuba and ceded Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States. The Spanish Empire, which had once ruled a quarter of the world, lost its last major colonies in less than 4 months. The year 1898 became known in Spain as the disaster, El Disaster. Station 9. From 1898 to World War I, Spain's low point. After the disaster of 1898, Spain was politically and economically weakened. Politically, Spain was a constitutional monarchy, but parliament was corrupt and unstable. After 1898, political factions, monarchists, Carlists, liberals, socialists, fought for power. In 1909, Barcelona's tragic week saw a violent uprising crushed by the army. Instability became the norm. Militarily, the army was shattered. Its structural weaknesses and moral failures cost Spain its last overseas empire. The army was demoralized, poorly equipped, and ossified. Diplomatically, stripped of its colonies, Spain sought international guarantees to protect its remaining territories, the Balearics, the Canaries, and the North African enclaves of Ceuta and Melilla. Spain remained neutral in World War I, too weak to fight. Economically, Spanish industry was concentrated in Catalonia, textiles, and the Basque Country, steel and shipbuilding. Compared to Britain, France, and Germany, Spain's industrialization was slow and painful. Agriculture still dominated, much of it trapped in feudal land tenure. Spain had gone from a global empire to a minor European power, unable to fight any large-scale war, surviving cautiously in the shadow of the great powers. Final station, the legacy of the Silver Empire. From 1492 to 1898, Spain traversed 400 years of rise and fall. It was the first true global empire, spanning 4 continents. It had the world's most powerful navy, making all Europe tremble. Its silver underpinned Europe's monetary system for over a century. In the 16th century, American silver accounted for about 85% of global production. Some 200 tons of gold and 18,000 tons of silver arrived in Spain from the Americas in that century alone. Yet this silver did not bring lasting prosperity. The sudden influx of silver triggered severe inflation. Spanish prices rose by about 400% in the 16th century, far more than elsewhere. Inflation made Spanish goods expensive, and imports surged while exports stagnated. By the early 17th century, Spain had become a net importer of grain. When silver imports peaked in the 1590s, 90% of Spain's manufactured goods were imported. Spain had become an empire with a poor country. Why? The Spanish did not use their wealth to build industry or technology. The aristocracy considered commerce beneath them, investing in land and luxuries instead of factories. While England and the Netherlands built mills and ships, Spain built churches and palaces. While other nations underwent scientific and industrial revolutions, Spain's Inquisition still burned books. Spain's crisis in the 17th century was total: economic decline, population loss, administrative paralysis, military defeat, the end of global hegemony. The Dutch and Portuguese revolts and indigenous uprisings in the Americas tore the empire from within. Externally, France ended Spanish dominance in Europe, while the Dutch and British overtook Spain at sea. A nation's true strength lies not in how much silver it digs up, but in what it creates with that wealth. Spain had wealth, but no sustainable prosperity, territory, but no lasting power. Yet Spain gave the world far more than silver and war. In the 17th century, at the very moment of its decline, came one of humanity's greatest literary works, Don Quixote. Miguel de Cervantes, born in 1547 to a wandering surgeon's family, served in the Spanish army in Italy, was captured by pirates on his return in 1575, and imprisoned in Algiers for 5 years. His own tragic captivity gave him the perspective to write a novel that mocked the absurdity of chivalry, and mocked the Spain that dreamed imperial dreams. The 16th and 17th centuries were Spain's literary golden age, with humanism, Baroque, and picaresque novels. In art, El Greco, Velázquez, and Zurbarán developed Mannerist and realist portrait styles. Velázquez captured the glory and decay of the Spanish court. These cultural treasures outlast any silver. Though the Spanish Empire has been gone for over a century, its language, Spanish, is still spoken by nearly 500 million people worldwide. Its culture still resonates from Mexico to Argentina, from the Philippines to Equatorial Guinea. Perhaps that is more enduring than any empire. The story of Spain teaches us a profound lesson. Wealth is not power, and territory is not strength. A nation can possess all the silver in the world, but if it fails to build the economic structures to absorb and use that wealth, if it fails to develop the industry and technology for lasting prosperity, that wealth will flow into the pockets of others. Spain brought back untold silver, but most of it flowed to the merchants and bankers of other European countries to buy the goods they produced. The Spanish themselves never used that wealth to build industry or technology. Spain's fall was not because it lacked resources, but because it lacked the ability to transform them. It had silver but no industry, territory but no power. It was once the mightiest empire on earth, yet it ended as a rich empire with a poor country. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Spain's rise and fall. If you are interested in European history, in our next episode, we will enter the eve of the First World War to see how the great powers drifted into the abyss under the illusion of peace. By studying history, we understand the rise and fall of nations. I am Lawrence Stardust. See you next time.